So we're moving from talking about stay-at-home dads to talking about working mothers. And a working mother doesn't necessarily mean that there's a stay-at-home dad, because it may be that if a heterosexual couple, and if there is a couple, that he may be working, she may also be working. One of the things that the data have shown is that it doesn't seem to make a lot of difference upon girls' and boys' outcomes as adults, as children, or as adults, on fathers working, or not much that I've really seen. But it does make a difference when mothers work. So let's look at that. Right. And this is a really important study. When it came out, it made a lot of news. It's a big study. So it's McGinn, Castro, and Lingo, 2018. And they looked at over 100,000 men and women across 29 countries. So it's this large cross-national study. And here is what they found. It's very important. When looking at daughters as adults and sons as adults who had mothers that worked, they found that the daughters of working mothers were more likely, when they became adults, to be employed. I think actually it was called paid labor in the study. But yeah, to be employed. I mean, they might have been self-employed, but still employed, right? So they engaged in paid labor. So they were not, the idea is that they were not, they did not identify them, like I said, necessarily as stay-at-home mothers. They were more likely to have a job, to be employed. And in that job, they were more likely to be supervising others. What this is indicating, not demonstrating 100% here, but indicating, is that they are more likely then, having a stay-at-home, or having a working mother, these daughters then were more likely to move into more of a management position. So be in probably a higher position within an organization. So they're more likely to be supervising others. They're more likely to be working more hours, and all this, I'm saying all this more, as compared to daughters of mothers who did not have work outside the home, or have paid labor, I should say. Sometimes people work from home, but engage in paid labor, right? And these daughters also had higher incomes, probably related in part to the fact that they're supervising, but even still, yeah, so that's what we see. That mothers who work outside the home, their daughters as adults, more likely to be employed, supervise others, work more hours, earn higher income, and spend less time on household tasks, right? To spend less time doing the cleaning and the shopping and the cooking. So that's the effects we saw in the mothers. What about the sons? There's not a whole lot. There doesn't seem to be any difference in terms of all the stuff about employment and supervising. Doesn't seem to affect anything one way or the other. But has one really interesting outcome. Or, well, a couple actually. These men, as adults, were more likely to spend more time doing domestic labor than, say, the sons of mothers who did not have employed or paid work. Right? Yeah, so they were more likely to spend more time caring for the children in the house, for grocery shopping, meal prep, right? That doing the domestic labor. That's actually something they were shown to be more likely to do. And, by the way, they had higher scores of egalitarianism. Again, that term, again, we just talked about a minute ago, right? Or in the previous part of this lecture. Higher scores of egalitarianism as opposed to sons whose mothers did not have paid labor. So again, believing in women and men actually having equal roles. And in fact, interesting little tidbit here, these men's scores, in fact, were higher on average. I mean, we're talking about 100,000 plus people here. So, on average, these men's scores were higher than the women who were daughters of stay-at-home mothers. That is to say that the men with stay-at-home or with mothers who worked outside the home had higher scores of egalitarianism than men whose mothers stayed at home and whose daughters, and both the sons and the daughters whose mothers stayed at home, right? So these sons as adults had higher egalitarian scores, believing that women and men should have equal roles, responsibilities, and treatment, etc., than both sons and daughters raised by stay-at-home mothers. So, yeah, it's a pretty strong impact. I want to close this slide by saying this is not me shaming any woman for being a stay-at-home mother. I'm saying, one, assuming this is outcomes. And two, this has been really important data for many women who were, like my own wife, my own partner, who often feels that she receives messages from society that she's a failure as a mother and somehow harming her children by working outside the home, when we're seeing signs of certain advantages for those children. Right, so this is not about shaming mothers for staying at home, but showing that, listen, by a mother working outside the home, there's a lot of good stuff that can go with it, so don't feel shamed by it. I want to be clear that this is not me someone doing some mother shaming thing. Not interested in that. Right. So there's some notes on parenting and race. And we don't have a lot of really neat studies of like, here's one of mothers and daughters that is exactly parallel to this one of fathers and sons. We don't really have that. In fact, what I'm going to show you is talking about some issues of parenting and race. What I want you to notice is just how much the dynamic and the relationship between parents and children is affected by things like race. So just to understand that these are very dynamic relationships. I don't want to get too much into family calm stuff here, keeping it more about gender. But I want to talk about the relationships of mothers and daughters, and then in a moment, fathers and sons. Just a few studies I looked at to give you some sense of the way that race is a huge impact in understanding these relationships, or is a major factor in understanding them. So, for instance, one study looked at Latina mothers and daughters after La Quinceañera, when they're 15 years old, which is an important, or may identify as being an important rite of passage. And so there was this hope by the daughters, the girls, that were hoping that after their quinceañera, that then they would have a lot more autonomy. Well, the moms weren't so excited about that. They didn't want to give them so much autonomy, but they did allow them some personal freedoms of like how they're going to, how they're going to dress, wearing makeup and things like that. And some, it was like group dating, but they didn't give them all sorts of freedom to now stay out late and do things like that. All right. So you do see one dynamic there. And what's sort of interesting is that here is a cultural group with this ceremony about a rite of passage for turning, as one turns 15, as a girl turns 15, that we don't really have in other cultures, and even in certain cultures that I'm aware of, this dominant, white culture anyway. We have the Sweet 16, but that's not seen necessarily a rite of passage the way the quinceañera is, right? You also want to look in your textbook on the way that black and white mothers and daughters engage. The mothers talk about how they engage the daughters differently. About actually, it's from an article called "Playground versus Training Ground." So make sure you're looking at that. But there's another study about African American daughters and what had they learned about self-esteem and identity from their mothers. And so one of the things is that these women, the daughters, said that their relationship with their mothers was a sort of no-filter relationship. Everything was much more, was very out in the open. We don't see that, by the way, across all racial identities between mothers and daughters, but they characterized it as being a very sort of no-filter relationship. And they said that they felt their mothers really encouraged a sense of self-pride and esteem, especially around issues of race, to be their racial identity, to feel proud of themselves and feel good of themselves as women, but especially, and also especially as black women. These women talked about as well that the way they saw their mothers modeling resilience. And resilience in two forms. Some could have been in the face of struggles, and those struggles were sometimes, but not always, but they were sometimes racial in nature, right? Which is to say, because of systemic and structural racism, right? They saw their mothers as models of resilience in the face of those challenges, and also when facing personal failures. Right, so that's what one of the things that these daughters talked about, what they learned about from their mothers, especially when it comes to self-concept and self-esteem. And a study by Ide et al. From 2018, there's about 5 or 6 authors there, on fathers and sons. This was an interesting comparison of 3 different race or ethnic identities and how the sons saw their fathers. Among the Asian sons, they saw their fathers as being disconnected, right? So not just not around, that's not the same thing, but disconnected, like just not engaged with them, the sons, and what was going on in their lives. They saw their fathers as being disconnected, and they reported having very little and when they were young, having very little interaction with their fathers. And that's something that sort of carried over then into when they were an adult. But they found that there was not much interaction with their fathers, and they criticized their fathers for being too work-oriented, focusing too much on work, and they said these sons reported their fathers emphasized too much their obligation as being a provider, and so therefore working long, hard hours, which of course the fathers are doing for the well-being of the family, but the sons felt the dads, in fact, were prioritizing that role of being this provider, and working was emphasizing that over being there for them, which is interesting when you consider the work of Triandus and others on collectivism, in which we find that in Asian cultures are more collectivistic. And so the father working for the sake of the family and not for himself is pretty consistent with that. But these men, this was here in the United States, by the way, the fathers said they were just too work-oriented. As a result, these sons did not want to emulate their fathers. They did not see their father as being a role model for masculinity, for manhood, for to differentiate those, for being the potential of fatherhood. Actually, it made some of the sons, Asian sons, in fact, reported concerns about becoming a father because they were concerned that structurally, in the workplace, they would be prohibited from engaging their family the way that they wish their father had with them. So, but yes, they did not want to emulate their father in terms of being a man, and even weren't sure then about being fathers, but definitely didn't want to emulate them in terms of their masculinity. And in fact, they wished they had more of a sort of white father model, a father, and we're going to talk about that here in a few minutes, but a father who was around much more and much more engaged. The fairly traditional image we have of the middle-class white father, which sort of will be holding up when we talk about it here, but they actually wish they had more of that experience. Just as a note here as we go on to other things, these sons did not make any observations about issues of class or race, really, in terms of their relationships and what they saw of their fathers. Black sons of black fathers, making that clear, right? They saw their fathers as being distant when they were young, not disconnected, not just not engaged with them, but just always sort of keeping them at this distance rather than just being disconnected, right? Not engaged at all, just at a distance. As they got older, they came to see their fathers were, in fact, as one of the terms from the article, just laid back or cool, right? That they said as their fathers, it was just more of a laid back style. And so it wasn't they were, and this was something they said they recognized as they moved into their early adult years, 18, 19, 20. This is what they recognized, is that their fathers, they thought they were really just distant when they were young, but then came to see them as just being much more laid back. They said when they looked at their fathers, they saw how their fathers and their relationship with them was impacted by issues of race and racism within dominant U.S. culture. So that was something that they did, in fact, speak to about that, and how they saw their father having to face those challenges and deal with them. And they said that as they got older, they felt that the relationship became more egalitarian. I'm saying egalitarian, that REL is just an abbreviation for relationship. But they came to feel the relationship they had with their father was more egalitarian, that where their father had been distant, they realized that was a little bit more laid back, and as they got older, that their father treated them a little bit more like a peer. So more egalitarian, were treated more of being equals with each other. And these were men, and these men felt that, in fact, they wanted to emulate their father. They wanted to be a dad like their dad was. Sort of cool and laid back, and that was all right. As they got older, being more engaged with them, treating them more like a peer, in a sort of guiding, mentoring way. That was the black sons. But the white sons saw their fathers as very connected. And there's a certain amount of data on this about the amount of time that white fathers versus other racial identity fathers, or fathers of other racial identities, spend with their children and attending children's events and so forth. That data does sort of hold up pretty well. These men said that when they largely regarded their father as being a friend, even from the time they were little. From the time they were young, their father was like their buddy. somebody they went and they did these things with. And that was something that they reported. His father's connected and sort of a friend. And they felt, though, that relationship began to change as, again, they came into their adult years, 18, 19, 20. And same as with the Black Sons, reporting that the relationship became more egalitarian. That it was their friend, but now they felt that they were being given more respect to go and do things just more as an equal. More as an equal. Their dad was always there trying to be their buddy and their friend, but as they got older, it became much more even egalitarian because there was still a clear father-son relationship, but now it was, that their father was less, as some would say, on their case, right? They allowing them to make more mistakes and things like that. And not too surprisingly, these men then also wanted to emulate their fathers. These men also did not make any observations about issues of race or class, the privilege that they enjoyed. They didn't really seem to be saying anything about that. Right? So I share this with you. It's not all-encompassing. It's also not a family communication class, so I can't really do that. But just to show you that if we're interested in issues of gender and parent-child relationship, there are some things I'm going to and we've talked about that some with some class presentations. I'm going to touch on something here in a moment. But overall, what we see is that race is a huge factor in understanding it. And so we have to understand, again, the intersectional nature of identity as being really crucial to understanding people's experiences and how they communicate with each other. So we're talking about families. I want to take a moment to talk about who's getting hitched. This is just a quick rundown of some things. You might notice the rates are changing by generation. And when you see these years that have been written on here, like right here, there's this whole column here of these years. That was that in the year 2019, they were between 23 and 38 years old. In 2003, they were between 28 and 30, or 23 and 38 years old, etc. So what you see is that yes, subsequent generations are getting married at lower rates, right? You do see that there are racial differences in terms of who's getting married, and that education seems to also play a role in who's getting married. So not a specifically a gendered thing, but as we're talking about issues of intimacy in the family and so forth. I thought it was useful to look at that just for a moment, just to see that it, again, differences by race and by class, and also by generation about who's getting married, right? So if we're looking at talking about families, who is it wants to be a parent? We need to, I want to look at the data here, and again, this is from 2013, so it's not super recent, but it's not terribly old, thank you. If we start looking here, we have, all men and all women. And I want to show you that if we add up those, this dark green is those who are, so the key up here is currently parents versus who would like to be parents. This score here, that number is 91. So 91% of all men, regardless of sexual orientation or identity or gender identity, they of 91% want to be parents. Among women, that number is, if I'm doing my math correctly, 92. Right? So you're not seeing a whole lot of difference. That's one thing worth noting, is that there's not a great difference overall between women and men and who is and wants to be a parent. As we look at this data, we see that certain other patterns do emerge. And so overall, if we look at the numbers by men, right, these numbers here for men, these numbers for women, again, we're seeing patterns about sex and gender here, that overall women do seem to have a greater desire to have children than do men within the queer community. So that's a certain pattern we're seeing here. And something else to notice about sexuality are that in both cases, right here among bisexual women and here among bisexual men, those rates of parenting and wanting to be a parent are a little bit higher, right? And now bear in mind, this top line here is all LGBT, right? This is all LGBT, whereas, so this subsumes, right, these two numbers. So you really want to compare, this is, set A, and this is data set B. And you want to look at the difference of, again, data set A and data set B, right? Because this number up here, right, includes both sets A and B. Hoping that's making sense to you, right? When we look at that, we look at the gay men and lesbians, those numbers aren't as high as those of bisexual women and men. And so we're seeing some patterns with regard to sexuality, and that may just be the fact that maybe the extent to which bisexual men and women participate in both queer and heterosexual communities, that could be an impact of that. I'm not making any attributions here, but I want you to recognize these patterns that we're seeing that of LGBT women and men, women are more likely to have and want children, and among both queer identified women and men, it's those who are identified as who identify as bisexual are more likely to have and to want to have children. So it's just, there are some patterns there that I want you to take note of. And as we're talking about parents and children, I want to talk about the important role that parents have in gendering their children. I mean, if we go back to the lecture on gender and chapter on gender theories, we understand the importance of parents, and by parents I mean those who raise children, whether they are technically a parent or they're a grandparent or they are a foster parent or they're an aunt or uncle, etc. But the important role they play, those adults play in gendering children, right? So the book talks about the research on toys and who is more likely to get which sorts of toys, and has some examples in there. You can go and look at that. I'm sure you have already, but make sure you're looking back at that. From class presentations, we saw about the research on chores, and that, excuse me, boys really not so much doing girls' chores, but girls sometimes doing what are seen as more as the boys' chores. That was part of something that came out of class discussion a certain amount. And I want to discuss the way all of that demonstrates a certain pattern that's emerging here. And the pattern emerging here in terms of the toys that parents are selecting for children to play with and the chores that children are often doing around the house, right? So who's having to do the cleaning and who's going out and doing the yard work, certain patterns seem to emerge. And that is, boys doing boy stuff seems to be okay, and girls doing girl stuff seems to be okay. And I think you know what I mean by boy stuff and girl stuff. Male typed or female typed tasks, right? And girls doing the boy stuff seems to be pretty okay, right? Whether it's with the boys' toys or doing boys' chores, everybody seems to be pretty okay with. But nobody, or not, I shouldn't say nobody, but there is, people don't seem to be generally so good with boys doing the things that are girls, right? And that's a pattern that keeps emerging in a number of places, but we're seeing it here with these data sets that we're looking at. And overall, it suggests that what we get is a devaluing of the feminine, right? That people seem to not value the things that women or that girls do, and the tasks they have, the toys they have, they're seen somehow as not being as valuable or as good. So if a girl does it, well, that's okay, she's a girl. Perhaps says something about the way that we value males and females differently in society, but we don't want boys to do it. And it suggests, again, that there is the ways in which we devalue the feminine in our culture. And I would like to go a step further to say that it's this notion of the things that are of girls are potentially pollution to a boy, right? They are pollution. They're going to feminize him in some way. It's seen as sort of pollution, sort of a thing that's just sort of not great or not good to do. I mean, my favorite example comes from of this off the top of my head, comes from your textbook and talking about the NASCAR Barbie. So if you look at the textbook, you know what I'm talking about, right? Whereas for the girl to do the thing the boy does, like the father talked about the girl being athletic, that's an asset, right? So again, we just have a pattern we're seeing as we're being gendered by, as we are gendering children. I mean, gendered as we are gendered as children, and then when we go to gender children by, as we raise them, this pattern in which we have a tendency to devalue that which is associated with the feminine, and see that girls doing what the boys do as being an asset, but for a boy to do what the girl does is seen somehow as being pollution. If you think about toys, games, activities, chores, dress, behaviors, right? What do we see as being problematic versus what do we see as being empowerment? And just something for you to consider Well, not really to consider, but it's a point I want to raise. We're talking about the gendering.